What famous person made the following statement? At no very distant date, what an endless number of the lower races will have been eliminated by the higher civilized races of the world. Was it A. Adolf Hitler, B. the father of eugenics, C. James Earl Ray, the man who killed Martin Luther King Jr., or D. Charles Darwin? If you guessed Adolf Hitler or the father of eugenics, you're wrong, but close. The correct answer is the man who inspired them both, Charles Darwin. So just who was Charles Darwin? He was a racist, wealthy Victorian. Darwin never got a science degree, and he never got a job. So why were Darwin's ideas about evolution embraced? The reasons were primarily ideological. Beginning in the late 1700s, people believed that competition between groups resulted in the elimination of inferior people and the flourishing of superior people. Darwin's theory about the survival of the fittest seemed to confirm this belief. Darwin himself hoped that natural selection would lead to the elimination of inferior races. This worldview permeated the pseudoscience Darwin was obsessed with. The full title of his most famous book is rarely mentioned. The title is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. This book and the worldview it espoused inspired Adolf Hitler and the famous book he wrote, Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle. Like Hitler, Darwin was a dropout. After quitting medical school, Darwin studied to be a clergyman of all things, but never pursued employment in this field either. Darwin was rich, and he married rich. But while Darwin had ample amounts of money, he lacked what is considered today to be basic knowledge of biology. Most importantly, Darwin was ignorant about genetics. He didn't even understand what DNA is. This is a problem. Formulating a theory of evolution while being ignorant about DNA is like formulating a theory of disease while being ignorant about germs, which people did do with predictable results. Their theories appeared plausible at the time, but they were ultimately proven to be wrong once science had advanced. Like his contemporaries, Darwin's knowledge of the history of life on Earth was poor. Darwin didn't even know what the first life form was. But this ignorance did not stop him from asserting that it, whatever it was, became this incredible thing, being the ancestor of every plant, animal, and human that ever lived. Is making such an assertion about an organism, the nature of which Darwin knew nothing about, compliant or contrary to the scientific method? Professionals today cannot draw conclusions the way Darwin did and be taken seriously. Not surprisingly, given the time in which he lived, Darwin also didn't know what the second and third life forms were, and as such, he had no knowledge of the lack of a genetic relationship between them. This is critical. They not only constituted different species, but different families, classes, and kingdoms. In fact, the genetic difference between the first, second, and third groups of organisms on Earth was even greater than this. A new category beyond kingdom had to be created. It's called domain. Essentially, the first, second, and third life forms on Earth were so genetically different and unrelated that they constitute three entirely different domains. This knowledge was not acquired until late in the 20th century, reducing the plausibility of Darwin's ideas. The truth is that life first appeared suddenly, and there is no conclusive, evidence-backed explanation for this. But this wasn't the end of the incredible story that is the history of life on Earth. New life forms continued to appear suddenly that were radically different genetically from anything that had preceded them, and there is no conclusive evidence-backed explanation for these organism groups either. There appears to be a life-generating process that has yet to be identified by scientists. Darwin actually believed that the first organism was a protein, and that it was the universal common ancestor of every plant, animal, and human. Now, never mind the fact that Darwin didn't even understand what a protein is. This lack of understanding explains why Darwin was wrong from the beginning. The first living thing could not have been a protein. Proteins are not even organisms, they are organic compounds. This is just one example of how Darwin was ignorant about the fundamental nature of life. The level of his ignorance was such that 12-year-olds today know more about biology than Darwin ever did. Yet the establishment has allowed this man to shape our understanding of what it means to be human and the nature of life itself. Essentially, Darwin claimed that it was advantageous traits facilitating fecundity that transformed the first life forms into billions of people. All of this amounts to a Victorian myth. In this respect, Darwinism is reminiscent of geocentrism, which was Aristotle's pseudoscientific theory about the Earth. Aristotle claimed that it was the sun that had an orbit and not the Earth. Supposedly, our home planet Earth was the center of the solar system, with the sun revolving around it. As we know now, Aristotle could not have been more wrong, and he was considered at the time to be the greatest scientific mind that had ever existed. But the reality is that not only was Aristotle wrong about the fundamentals, but that the truth is the opposite of what he claimed. Nevertheless, Aristotle was so revered that people believed in his version of physical reality for 1,000 years. This only ended when science advanced to the point where it became apparent that Aristotle was wrong. All of the mounting evidence pointed to a different reality, one that Aristotle could not have conceived of, given the relatively limited amount of information available. Darwinism is suffering a similar fate. Our knowledge of genetics, specifically the complexity of the information-rich DNA molecule, has made it increasingly apparent that Darwinism is mostly wrong. Mostly is the correct word to use because there is an element of truth in Darwin's theory of evolution. But the greatest deceptions have an element of truth. That's what makes them so persuasive initially. Darwinism is correct to the extent that it explains phenotypic change within a species. In other words, Darwinism explains why a species' fixed traits change in shape, size, and color. We now know that this merely involves a change in what version of a gene is expressed. There can be multiple versions of a single gene. These different versions are called alleles. But Darwinism does not explain the emergence of new kingdoms or other high-level taxa, which required totally new genes. It required new genomes with at least thousands but often millions or billions of new base pairs. These millions or billions of new base pairs had to be put in a correct sequence known as a DNA code. While there are plenty of theories about how this happened, there is no detailed evidence-backed explanation for how these new organism groups emerged that is persuasive enough to be considered conclusive. In other words, there is no scientist who can explain how these radically new and increasingly complex DNA codes emerged. In the next video, we will explore more compelling reasons for why Darwinism is mostly wrong. This includes the Cambrian explosion, the event during which virtually all animal groups suddenly appeared. And we will also discuss Darwin's fake finches, the birds that supposedly prove that his theory of evolution was correct. We will investigate the extent to which this is true or false. See you then.